It's time for a chat with Pat. It's Thursday, and it's Joni.
Yeah, Joni would have to go to breakfast with us on Thursday.
Yeah, that'd be
That's
fine.
for sure.
Yeah.
Our guest today, as you well know, if you listen to this show, is Joan Watson. She is an author. She is a speaker. She is a marvelous lady, and we're always so glad to have her on Thursdays. Joni, so how's your Lenten journey going?
It's going better. We're sticking to the plan so far.
Because last week, right off the bat, you told us, I messed up already today. So, you're back on track.
Things are better.
Okay, good. I'm up and down. I haven't gotten a rhythm to this yet. But so, Joni, it's so great to have you with us again. And we're talking about Joan's book, Making a Pilgrimage a Companion for Catholics. And I'm so happy that we're going through this during Lent, but it's just obviously a great book for any time. And last week we were talking about chapter 5, Joni, and I knew we wouldn't get through it. So we're going to pick up with that today. And last week we talked a little bit about, what a pilgrimage is, but we also talked about how church fathers didn't always encourage people to go on pilgrimage, and that Jesus never mandated us to go on pilgrimage. It wasn't part of our faith in that sense. So before we launch into all the wonderful things the church fathers said to why we should go, I'd like to just, because you do bring Martin Luther up in this chapter, can you tell us what Luther said about pilgrimage? Because I think his concern, it wraps up nicely what we talked about last week.
Yeah, so Luther was not fond of pilgrimages, which you could imagine if you know anything about Luther's theology of justification and his idea of works and works being in vain. I actually talk about Luther later in the book as well, because it's his time in Rome that he later will say, like, while on pilgrimage in Rome, he kind of, set his theology why works are in vain. So, and while we don't believe that, we don't believe works are in vain, and we don't believe in Luther's justification theology, he does have kind of a cautionary, he doesn't mince words in caution about what makes you holy and what doesn't make you holy.
Right.
And I think just pointing out that you aren't holier because you go on pilgrimage.
Right.
You can be a terrible sinner. You can go to Rome, you can pray at these places, and you can be unrepentant in your heart. And that pilgrimage hasn't zapped you or been like this, And so I think we just have to make sure we're going on pilgrimage for the right reason, and be open to the grace of the Lord and be open to conversion while on pilgrimage. That's the whole point.
Yes.
And so I think he does give us kind of a cautionary tale.
Yeah, and that was kind of what we talked about last week, is that these are the things we need to kind of know. But you do say the church does attach grace to the practice of pilgrimage. So can you kind of lead us into this whole idea of, St. Jerome saying, trying to talk people into going to the Holy Land, or a friend of his, Gregory, doing the same thing. Why did they see it as an important thing? And then talk a little bit about this importance of place, as you call it.
Yeah, so there is grace. The church attaches grace to the practice of pilgrimage. It is a sacramental, so it leads us to the sacraments. It brings grace. If you go on pilgrimage with an open heart and open hands and an open mind, the Lord is going to fill that, and the Lord is going to answer that desire in your heart. And so there are great moments of conversion on pilgrimage. And again, I give some of those stories later in the book. There's stories of people who go on pilgrimage searching for a greater faith, and the Lord answers those prayers. So Jerome and Gregory point out the fact that, and this kind of goes with what you mentioned, the importance of place. There is purpose in traveling, first of all, because of all the lessons we learn on pilgrimage, and we've talked about that. But there's also a purpose in traveling to these places, because these places are real. And so, Jerome would write, if we reverence the temple, if we reverence the Holy of Holies, if we reverence the Ark of the Covenant in the Old Testament, why wouldn't we reverence the tomb of Christ in the New? Why wouldn't we reverence the cross that brought our salvation? And so to walk in these places, especially I think of the Holy Land, to walk where Jesus walked, there's a purpose to it, because God chose to come into history, and he chose to come to these places And these places are real. They're not just stories. They're not just places on a scripture page. But when you go to the Sea of Galilee, you know, your faith is increased because it goes from your head to your heart. And, you know, there's this saying that those are the longest 12 inches in all of the world, right? So for something to go from your head that you know intellectually to go into your heart, that's a long journey.
Yeah.
And that's what I found on pilgrimage, that I know these things intellectually. I know the truths of the gospel. I can tell you, yes, Jesus really existed. And I can tell you, yes, Moses was a real person. It wasn't until I was on Mount Nebo, which is where Moses died, and I was standing on Mount Nebo looking out over the Holy Land and looking out over the Promised Land. And I remember telling people, he was real. He really existed. And they looked at me like I was crazy. But the thought had gone from my head to my heart. And that's what pilgrimage does. It opens us up to these places, whether it's the Fatima, you know, and you're standing in the place where the miracle of the sun happened. You just read about it, but now you're in the place. And so there is an importance of place, and we see that on pilgrimage.
Joni, you also mention in this chapter that pilgrimage is a form of catechesis. What do you mean by that? Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so it really is a classroom. You know, if you're familiar with educational concepts like Maria Montessori and Sophia Cavalletti, they were very hands-on. They believed that because we take things into our mind through the senses, it's important for kids to, you know, have hands-on experiences to learn. And when I became formation director for the Diocese in Nashville, I was the director of adult formation for the diocese, I realized adults need hands-on, tangible experiences too. Yeah. You know, we're not going to go to the atrium and learn Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, although that changed my life as well, learning the concepts behind Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. But when we walk in these places, those are tangible moments that bring us into the scripture study, or into the scripture, and lead us into scripture study and lead us into love of scripture. And so there are things about the scriptures that you only really understand after you've walked. That's why Holy Land is called the fifth gospel. There are things you only understand when you see the culture that Christ grew up in. There are things you only understand when you go to Lourdes and you kneel at that grotto. And so really, pilgrimage is a classroom. It's a classroom that helps you learn more about yourself, definitely, but also about Christ and his church and the saints. You learn things by experience, and that's one of the beauties of pilgrimage.
And you kind of end this chapter by talking about pilgrimages can be a time of emptying. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that word gets tossed around. It does. Can be dangerous if we're talking about an emptying in the New Age sense, where we empty ourselves and make ourselves blank, and you know that can be very dangerous. And we're not talking about the New Age emptying, but rather that detachment, that moment where we make room in our souls for God to enter in. That's what Lent is all about, right? That's why Lent is a pilgrimage. We are slowly emptying ourselves, not to be blank slates, not to be some sort of, you know, to chant mantras and let ourselves, you know, be emptied, but to be filled with Christ and have that detachment. And that's what pilgrimage does. And that's what Lent does.
Excellent, Joni. Can't wait to get to the next chapter next week. Thanks so much for being with us, and have a great weekend ahead as we move into the second week of Lent.
Sounds great. Thanks, everybody. God bless.
Thank you.
Talk to you next week.